The air in the quiet, meticulously maintained cul-de-sac of Whispering Pines was usually thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the smug assurance of upper-middle-class domesticity. Today, however, it was poisoned with something far more acrid, the scent of new cedar and old spite. David stood in his backyard, his posture radiating a weary but firm pride, his gaze fixed on the magnificent 7-foot cedar fence that now bisected his property from his neighbor's. It was 1 foot, a mere 12 inches, higher than the neighborhood covenants technically allowed. A fact David knew with absolute certainty. He'd done it on purpose. He needed the privacy, a shield against the unrelenting, suffocating scrutiny of Carolyn Thorne. The woman the entire cul-de-sac, in hushed, eye-rolling tones, had already crowned Karen. The fence was a work of art, deep red cedar, vertical boards meticulously aligned, a clean, unblemished wall separating his tranquil world from her tempestuous one. "It is a monstrosity, David." The voice, as expected, was a honed instrument of irritation. Carolyn stood on her side of the property line, hands planted firmly on her hips. Her perfectly tailored capris and crisp white blouse only served to emphasize the rigidity of her conviction. She looked less like a neighbor and more like a field marshal inspecting a breach in enemy lines. David let out a slow, measured breath, turning to face her with a practiced neutrality. He'd been preparing for this confrontation since the first post went into the ground. "Good morning, Carolyn. Are you referring to the fence that's entirely on my property?" "Don't play coy with me," she snapped, her voice carrying across the silent, judging yards. "The covenants explicitly state 6 feet maximum for boundary structures. That is 7 feet. I've measured it, David, twice. My landscaper measured it too." She held up a cell phone, already dialed to an intimidatingly long number. "You have violated the aesthetic integrity of this street, and frankly, it infringes on my sunlight." David's jaw tightened. The woman had a copper frack $4 yard that was perpetually shaded by 2 ancient oaks, but the principle of the thing he knew was everything to her. This wasn't about the fence. It was about control. "Carolyn, I need 7 feet for privacy. My kids are teenagers. You and I both know the covenants are notoriously vague on side yard boundary fences. I've consulted a lawyer. The city code supersedes the HOA, and the city allows up to 8 feet on the rear and 7 feet on the side by permit." He crossed his arms. "I have the permit. Signed, stamped, and notarized." He watched the color drain from her face, a brief, beautiful flicker of shock. She hadn't expected him to do his homework. Most people in Whispering Pines simply crumpled under her glare. "A permit," she scoffed, recovering quickly, her voice taking on a dangerous low pitch. "You think a piece of paper signed by some low-level city official trumps the collective agreement of this community? You're mistaken. I am the head of the Architectural Review Committee. I am telling you as your neighbor and as an officer of the HOA that this fence must be reduced. If you don't have contractors here by tomorrow, I will issue a formal violation, complete with fines that will make that cedar look cheap." The threat wasn't hollow. Carolyn had a reputation for weaponizing HOA rules. Her fines started high and escalated daily. David's stomach twisted with dread, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't a rich man. He was a divorced father of 2 working 2 jobs. This fence had cost him a significant chunk of his savings, but the peace it provided was priceless. "You do what you need to do, Carolyn," David said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But I won't be taking down my fence. It stays." He turned his back on her, walking toward his patio. The heavy wooden gate separating their yard suddenly slammed open. Carolyn, moving with startling speed, was now a mere 3 feet behind him, her face a mask of white-hot fury. "You think you can just ignore me? I have lived on this street for 20 years. I helped write those bylaws. I'll make your life a living hell, David. I will make you regret the day you bought this house." David stopped, his body rigid. The threat felt too close, too personal. It wasn't just about fines anymore. It was war. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the genuine, unhinged malice in her gaze, the true cost of standing up to her. "Then I guess we both have a plan, Carolyn," David replied, his voice a low, hard rasp that felt alien even to his own ears. "Because I, unlike you, am not a quitter. He walked inside, the silence of his kitchen closing around him. He felt the weight of her stare on his back, even through the solid wood of his front door. The rest of the week was a blur of official-looking letters slapped onto his door, increasingly menacing fines, and the constant feeling of being watched. Every time he stepped outside, Carolyn was either conspicuously watering her petunias or leaning against her window, a silent, glaring sentinel. The stakes were clear. He could lose thousands in fines, or he could lose the privacy he desperately needed. The financial ruin was the real threat. He had to make the fence not just a boundary, but a deterrent. He had to make the cost of her intrusion exceed the petty satisfaction of her control. On Friday morning, while Carolyn was at her weekly mahjong game, David made a clandestine trip to a specialized nursery on the outskirts of the city, followed by a stop at a commercial electrical supplier. That evening, a transformation began. The first thing to go up were the lights, two massive, commercial-grade, 300-watt LED security floodlights, each with a new text, 180, Cirque motion sensor. They were mounted high on two sturdy steel poles just inside his property line, angled subtly away from his house but perfectly positioned to cast a blinding, stadium-quality glare over the entirety of Carolyn's adjacent yard. When they triggered, they didn't just illuminate. They scorched the darkness with a hostile, unforgiving white light. The second addition was the planting. Along the base of the 7-foot cedar, David meticulously installed a continuous row of Smilax aspera, a species known colloquially as razor ivy, a notoriously aggressive vine covered in backward-curving razor-sharp thorns, capable of climbing to 20 feet and forming an impenetrable, dangerous tangle. He ran thin guide wires up the cedar boards, ensuring the vines would have a fast, effective route to the top. It was less a garden feature and more a passive-aggressive, biological barbed wire. The final element, the one that truly sealed the fortress, was a small, weatherproofed audio sensor discreetly positioned near the top of the fence. It was linked to a recording on a tiny, hidden speaker, designed to play a single, piercingly unpleasant sound the moment anything or anyone came close to the cedar. The sun set on whispering pines, quiet and serene. At 9:15 p.m., Carolyn returned home. She stepped out of her Mercedes, expecting the usual comforting suburban glow. Instead, as she walked toward her front door, a small furry creature, a raccoon perhaps, or a stray cat, darted across the grass near the fence line. The first floodlight exploded into a harsh, brilliant day, bathing her entire front yard in a retina-searing white. Simultaneously, the small speaker by the fence crackled, then emitted a short, sharp, and shockingly loud burst of sound, the high-pitched, aggressive bark of a large territorial dog, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the ground itself. Carolyn froze, dropping her expensive leather purse. Her hands flew to her ears and she whirled around, momentarily blinded and deafened. The light made every shrub look like a hiding predator, and the sound felt like a direct, hostile warning. She stumbled back toward her front porch, her heart hammering against her ribs, the vision of David's cold eyes flashing in her mind. The floodlight held for a long, uncomfortable minute, then plunged the yard back into merciful darkness, leaving a lingering, ghostly image burned into her vision. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Carolyn looked at the magnificent, towering cedar wall, now a looming black silhouette against the bruised night sky, and she saw not a fence, but a statement. You crossed the line. This is my consequence. The silence lasted for about 10 seconds before the lights came on again, triggered by the faintest gust of wind and the sound system Y. The shotgun cocking sound, followed by the immediate blinding relapse into white light, was not a coincidence. It was a psychological operation. Carolyn Thorne scrambled inside her house. Her hand pressed against the frantic beat in her chest, the image of the fence now a hostile, fortified barrier permanently seared into her retinas. She stood in her living room, peering through the pristine window treatments. The 7-foot cedar wall, which she had initially seen as a mere aesthetic offense, now felt like a taunt, a symbol of David's impudent defiance. The lights had triggered 3 more times in the space of 5 minutes, always with the dog bark or the metallic click, even though nothing larger than a leaf had drifted past the sensor. David wasn't just defending his property. He was deliberately making hers uninhabitable. She snatched up her phone, her fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and incandescent rage. She didn't call the police. They would laugh at a complaint about bright lights and sound effects. She called the only number that mattered, Howard Sterling, the HOA lawyer and her closest ally on the Architectural Review Committee. "Howard, he's gone beyond violation," she hissed, keeping her voice low despite the throbbing adrenaline. "He has installed weapons on the boundary line." "Weapons, Carolyn? What are you talking about? Did he brandish something?" Howard's voice was the familiar tired drone of a man who dealt with wealthy suburbanites behaving badly on a daily basis. "No, not a gun. Though I heard a shotgun. He's installed stadium lights, blinding, obnoxious things that turn my backyard into a prison yard. And that noise, it's a sonic assault. And he's planted some kind of jungle vine, Howard. It looks dangerous, full of massive thorns. It's an immediate liability." Howard sighed audibly. "Carolyn, a homeowner has a legal right to install security lighting and motion-activated sound deterrents. If the lights aren't pointed directly at your windows, we have little recourse. The plant? Unless it's an invasive species or toxic, it's landscaping. David has been legally meticulous on the fence height. He likely has his bases covered here, too. You need to focus on the original violation, the height. The original violation is small potatoes now." Carolyn slammed her hand on the mahogany table. "He's doing this to drive me out. He's terrorizing me. I want you to issue a cease and desist on the lights and a demand for the immediate removal of that razor ivy. Frame it as a hazard to community safety. Tell him the fine for non-compliance is $500 a day, starting tomorrow for each offense. Carolyn, don't text $500 a day is unprecedented for a plant. Then make it now math BFQ $250 and all math BF $250 for the light system. Send math BF with $500 a day combined. I want maximum punitive pressure, Howard. If we let this man win, the entire covenant structure of Whispering Pines collapses. He's challenging my authority. He's challenging ours." A beat of silence hung on the line. Howard knew a lost cause when he saw one, but he also knew where his billable hours came from. "I'll draft the letter. But be warned, Carolyn, this is highly aggressive. David has shown he will fight. You may be escalating a battle you can't win." "I always win, Howard," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the fortress next door. Always. David read the official HOA letter on Saturday morning, sitting at his kitchen table. The coffee was cold, but the satisfaction was warm. The letter, penned in Howard Sterling's overly formal, menacing legal script, levied the Math BF $500 in daily fines against him. Math BF $250 for the excessive and intrusive lighting system, and Math BF in $250 for the introduction of hazardous and aesthetically disruptive flora. Citing the razor ivy, he actually smiled. It was exactly what he'd predicted. Carolyn wasn't just demanding compliance. She was demanding surrender. His phone rang. It was Sarah, his ex-wife. "David, what is going on over there?" Her voice was tight with worry. "Chloe just called me. She said Carolyn came into the front yard and was taking pictures of the fence with some kind of industrial camera. Chloe said she looked absolutely livid. She's escalating. Sarah, she's slapping me with the text, $500 in daily fines over the lights and the plants I put up. Text, $500 a day? David, we can't afford that. You're putting your equity at risk over a plant. Just take down the lights. It's not worth losing the house over." The fear in Sarah's voice was genuine, and it hit David harder than any HOA letter. The house was his family's stability, their anchor after the divorce. "I know what I'm doing, Sarah. I've already contacted Michael, the lawyer who handled the permit. He agrees we have a solid case against the fines. The lights are standard security and the plant is within code. But if I back down now, she wins permanently. She'll know she can steamroll me on everything. This isn't about the fence anymore. It's about not being bullied off my own property. It's about money, David. Real money. Don't let your stubborn pride blind you." It's about peace, Sarah. If she gets this control, she'll be on our side of the fence every single day for the next 10 years. I'm stopping this now. I'll call you later. Tell Chloe and Sam not to worry. David hung up, his hands shaking slightly. He knew the risk. If he lost the legal fight, the fines could bankrupt him. But seeing the fear in his children's eyes every time Carolyn glared at them was a heavier price. He had to be the wall. He walked out to his garage and pulled out a box of tools and another heavier coil of wire. This was only part 2 of his counter-strategy. The lights and the razor ivy were defensive. Now he needed to make the fence not just a boundary, but a deterrent to surveillance. For the next 2 hours, David worked on his side of the cedar. Using small stainless steel screws, he installed a dense grid of narrow-gauge, heavy-duty lattice along the top 2 feet of the fence. This lattice was fine enough to significantly obscure vision while not technically adding to the fence's legal height, but the final touch was the crucial one. He went back to the razor ivy and began carefully, painstakingly, weaving the first few strands of the vicious vine through the lattice. This was a commitment. The ivy was now legally part of the structure, guaranteed to climb and make the top of the fence an impenetrable, painful thicket within a month. When he was done, he stepped back. The fence was now formidable. Carolyn's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She saw the new lattice and the woven thorns late that afternoon. She grabbed her gardening shears, expensive, heavy-duty German steel, and marched out to the boundary line. She stood at the fence, her face twisted in a mask of frustrated fury, and brought the shears up, intending to snip the exposed, low-hanging strands of the ivy right on her property line. As the steel blades met the first, tough woody stem of the razor ivy, the sound sensor on David's side, which he had deliberately recalibrated to be hypersensitive, triggered. The security light didn't just flash. It locked on and stayed on, bathing her in its unholy glow. But David had changed the sound. Instead of a dog bark or a click, the small weatherproof speaker, now tucked securely beneath the cedar cap, emitted a sound that stopped Carolyn's breath. A crisp, electronically filtered recording of her own voice from her initial confrontation with David. Recording, abridged, clipped, and amplified. Make your life a living hell, David. I will make you regret the day you bought this house. The recording played twice, followed by a new sound effect, a low, menacing electronic buzz that slowly built in intensity, like a warning siren. Carolyn dropped the shears as if they were hot coals. Not only was the light blinding and the sound humiliating, but David was now using her own words as a weapon against her. He was showing her that he had been recording their interactions, that he was prepared, and that her attempts to tamper with his landscaping had been met with a precise, public, and profoundly unnerving countermeasure. She stood, trapped in the harsh white spotlight, the sinister buzz vibrating in the air, a spectator to her own public shaming. She realized with a chill that went straight to her bones that David wasn't just fighting back. He was studying her, anticipating her moves, and using her own tactics against her with ruthless efficiency. She retreated hastily, her reputation shredding with every step, the sound of her own furious voice echoing in her ears. The fence now looked less like a battle line and more like a high-voltage cage. That night, an hour after the sun had fully set, David received a text message, not from Howard, but directly from Carolyn's personal number. The text message, unpunctuated, all caps. You think this is funny. You think you're clever. You will pay for this humiliation I have called. The city permit office, I am demanding an immediate re-inspection for code violations. I am going to find something that isn't 7 feet, and I am going to have it torn down. You watch. David read the message, his jaw set. She was going for the kill shot, calling the municipal authorities, hoping to find a technicality he had missed. He knew his permit was ironclad, but a city inspection was a major escalation that involved the bureaucracy. The one thing he couldn't entirely control. He looked out the window at the looming shadow of the fence. He replied with a single word. David's reply. The word try hung in the digital air, a gauntlet thrown directly at Carolyn Thorne. She stared at the single, icy reply on her screen, the simplicity of it fueling her indignation. David wasn't just resisting. He was inviting her best shot. Her threat to call the city was no longer just a threat. It was a necessary declaration of war. Monday morning found Carolyn at the municipal offices, dressed impeccably in a power suit that suggested she was there to buy the city, not just complain to it. She was ushered into the small, windowless office of Mr. Henry Davison, the chief inspector for permits and code enforcement, a man whose weary eyes suggested he'd seen every petty neighbor dispute Whispering Pines could invent. "Mr. Davison, I have filed a formal complaint regarding the structure at 4218 Maplewood," she began, her tone sharp and practiced. "The owner, Mr. David Miller, has a fence that violates the height covenant, and he has fortified it with hazardous material and an intrusive light and sound system." Davison slowly leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil against a thick file. "Yes, Mrs. Thorne, we have the file. And we have Mr. Miller's original permit for the fence. It clearly states the city allows 7 feet on the side yard by variance, which was granted." Carolyn waved her hand dismissively. "That's the HOA covenant, Mr. Davison, and we are handling the fines internally. My concern now is the lighting and the hazardous planting, razor ivy. It's a health hazard. Furthermore," she leaned across his desk, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "I believe he may have an unpermitted electrical modification for those atrocious floodlights. They are industrial grade. That requires a separate electrical inspection." Davison stopped tapping his pencil. This was a new angle. Unpermitted electrical work was a serious code violation, punishable by heavy fines and mandatory teardown. "That's a different matter, Mrs. Thorne. If he tied into the main line without an electrician's permit, we would have jurisdiction." "I'm certain he did." The lights came on instantly. "It's not just a plug-in system, and they are mounted on non-standard steel posts, which may also violate setback requirements." She pushed a small, crisp photo across the desk, a close-up of the fence line, focusing on the small junction box David had installed near the ground. "I believe this is your entrance." Davison studied the photo. He knew that for residents like Carolyn Thorne, it wasn't about safety or code. It was about victory. But unpermitted electrical work was too big to ignore. "Very well, Mrs. Thorne," Davison conceded, giving a curt nod. "We will schedule a joint inspection, code enforcement for the posts and lights, and the electrical safety authority for the wiring. We will be out there tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. You and Mr. Miller will be notified." David received the official notification via an email stamped with the city seal. Notice of joint code and electrical inspection. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had meticulously secured the fence permit, but the quick weekend installation of the lighting system hadn't included filing a separate permit for the low-voltage wiring he'd run from his outdoor outlet. He'd used a licensed contractor for the outlet installation years ago, but the new circuit extension was definitely a gray area he'd intentionally skirted to save time and money. He'd prioritized speed over bureaucracy. He immediately called Michael, his lawyer. "She's escalating, Michael. She's called the city on the lights and the razor ivy. They're doing a joint inspection tomorrow." "Damn it, David," Michael groaned. "I told you she wouldn't stop." "The razor ivy is fine. It's not a municipal violation. But the lights, did you run any new high-voltage lines or hardwire them?" "No, they're low-voltage LED, running off an existing GFCI outlet I had installed. I didn't file a new permit for the wiring extension itself. It's only Natex 12-volt wiring, Michael. It doesn't matter. If it's permanently installed into the ground or a structure, some inspectors will argue it requires a low-voltage landscape lighting permit, especially for commercial-grade lights. And if the posts they're mounted on are considered accessory structures that violate the setback, you're in trouble. They can fine you and order you to remove the entire setup, lights, posts, everything." Michael's voice was grim. "You should have filed for that 1-hour job. This is exactly the kind of technicality a vindictive neighbor is looking for." "So what's the move?" David asked, his voice steady despite the rising pressure. "You have 2 options. Option A is to try and tear the whole thing down tonight. But that means she wins, and the HOA fines still stand for the days it was up. Option B is you let them inspect and we fight the violation. But if they issue a teardown order, we have to comply immediately or face daily city fines on top of the HOA ones." The stakes just went parabolic, David. David looked out his window. The razor ivy was already beginning its aggressive climb up the lattice. If he tore the lights down now, he'd be admitting guilt and handing Carolyn a psychological victory she would exploit forever. "We go with option B," David said, his voice hard. "She wants a fight on the ground of her choosing." "Fine. I trust my setup is structurally sound. I'll prepare for the inspection. Just be ready to file an immediate injunction if they order a teardown." Tuesday morning, 9:55 a.m. The air was thick with humidity and anticipation. David stood in his yard, flanked by Michael, who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the suburban drama. Across the fence line, Carolyn stood in her yard with Howard Sterling. The two teams were separated by the imposing 7-foot cedar wall, which now bristled with thorny ivy and glared down with the massive, unlit security lights. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a City of Whispering Pines truck pulled up. Out stepped Mr. Davison, and a man in a hard hat labeled "Electrical Safety." The tension was suffocating as the two inspectors walked the fence line, starting with Carolyn's side. She pointed dramatically at the lights and the ivy. "Note the intensity, gentlemen. They are clearly designed to disrupt. And the plant, it's an obvious hazard. A child could be severely injured." Davison scribbled notes. "The plant is not on the prohibited species list, Mrs. Thorne, and the lights are currently off. We are here to inspect the posts and the electrical connection." They moved to David's side. The electrical inspector, a meticulous, silent man, immediately focused on the wiring. He traced the low-voltage line from the floodlights down the steel pole, across the ground, and to the junction box David had installed near the original GFCI outlet. He knelt, opening the box and testing the current. The silence was broken only by the sharp, metallic snap of the inspector's voltmeter. Davison was inspecting the steel posts, measuring their distance from the property line. "The posts are a full foot inside the property line, Mr. Miller. No setback violation for accessory structures." He looked at the electrical inspector, who was now slowly straightening up. "Findings?" The electrical inspector pulled off his glove, his face unreadable. "The circuit is safe, Mr. Davison, but I have found a low-voltage circuit extension. Mr. Miller, you have commercial-grade fixtures. Do you have a permit for the low-voltage installation?" David was about to speak to admit the oversight when Michael smoothly stepped in. "The fixture is UL-rated, Inspector. The power draw is minimal. We argue that running a low-voltage line from an existing permitted outlet is de minimis alteration, akin to plugging in a large Christmas light display. It's not hardwired, it's a connection to an existing, safe, permitted circuit." The inspector shook his head slowly. "A permanent fixture requires a permit, regardless of voltage. It's non-compliant. We can issue a fine and demand a permit be filed, or we can order immediate removal of the circuit." Across the fence, David saw a smug, victorious smile spread slowly across Carolyn's face. She had found her technicality. "We order immediate removal of the circuit and fixtures," Carolyn's lawyer, Howard, shouted across the line, not waiting for the city to speak. "The violation is established." Davison looked at the non-compliant wiring, then at the massive, glaring lights, and finally at the poisonous, thorny ivy climbing the fence. He looked at David, who met his gaze with defiance. Then he looked at the self-satisfied, victorious face of Carolyn Thorne across the fence. Davison sighed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card. "Mr. Miller, you are in violation of a text, Section 41C, for an unpermitted low-voltage landscape lighting installation. The fine is Damath BF $150. You must file for the proper permit within 30 days. He paused, and a long, drawn-out beat of silence filled the tense air. Then he turned to Carolyn's side of the fence, his voice suddenly loud and authoritative. "However, Mrs. Thorne," Davison announced, his eyes fixed on her stunned face, "your fence posts are not the only thing in my inspection today. I also investigated the unauthorized installation of the surveillance device on the boundary line." Carolyn blinked. "What surveillance device?" "The one that is clearly visible in the photograph you provided to me," Davison said, pointing to the fence line, not at the lights but at the small, dark. The Namath BF 1000 privacy violation fine was a stinging public humiliation for Carolyn Thorne. She hadn't just lost the city inspection battle. She had been exposed as the neighborhood surveillance culprit by her own evidence, while David received a comparatively mild slap on the wrist. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. The following morning, she found a discreetly folded, laser-printed note tucked into her mailbox. It wasn't from David, but from her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman Carolyn had once browbeaten into removing a gnome statue. The note simply read, "Looks like your own fence had eyes, Carolyn." "Justice is expensive." Carolyn crumbled the note in her hand. The whispers were starting. The city fine had validated David's narrative. She was the controlling tyrant, and he was the man simply defending his private life. Her power, built on the pillars of impeccable decorum and absolute control, was visibly cracking. Her rage, previously focused on winning, now narrowed into a chilling, absolute demand for vengeance. She wasn't fighting for the fence height anymore. She was fighting for her reputation, her authority, and her very position in the hierarchy of Whispering Pines. She called Howard Sterling, the HOA lawyer, immediately. "The city fine is an outrage." "Howard, but it is a diversion. Our true authority is the HOA. David still has boss math BF of $500 a day in fines accruing for the lights and the ivy. I want the enforcement hearing scheduled immediately. We will make an example of him." Howard sounded weary. "Carolyn, your position is weakened. We can't fine him for the lights. The city has essentially deemed them compliant with a minor permit correction, and the ivy is just a plant. I advise we drop the fines, let him file the permit, and focus solely on the fence height. It's a cleaner case." "No," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "The ivy is a hostile architectural feature. It is designed to look like razor wire, and it violates the covenant against offensive or aggressive visual elements. And the lights, even if permitted, are still excessive and intrusive under the general covenant of neighborhood harmony. We will hold the hearing and we will win, or I will resign from the committee and tell the entire community that you and the HOA board abandoned the bylaws." The threat was effective. Howard sighed. "Fine. The hearing is scheduled for Friday evening. You will need to present your case to the full Architectural Review Committee, not just me, and David will be there." David spent the next 3 days filing the low-voltage lighting permit, an ironically simple process that cost him math BF $40 and took 20 minutes. He removed the audio sensor, satisfying the city's ruling. But he did not pay the Tamath BF $2,000 in accumulated HOA fines. He was saving that money for his lawyer. On Friday evening, the HOA hearing was held in the antiseptic, fluorescent-lit community clubhouse meeting room. David sat at a small table, Michael beside him. Across the room sat Carolyn, flanked by Howard Sterling, and 3 other committee members who looked distinctly uncomfortable, being caught between the neighborhood queen and the man who'd just given her a text, 1,000. "City fine," Carolyn began, her presentation meticulously structured. She used a projector, displaying slides of David's property that focused on the aggressive look of the fence. "Look at this structure," Carolyn declared, pointing to a magnified image of the razor ivy weaving through the lattice. "This is not a garden. It is a medieval deterrent. It is sharp, dangerous, and violates the covenant on aggressive or visually offensive landscaping. It promotes discord. It encourages confrontation." She switched the slide to a harsh, overexposed photo of her yard when the floodlights had triggered. "And these lights, they are not security. They are a weapon of intimidation. They are excessive and violate the spirit of neighborhood harmony. Mr. Miller's entire response is an act of spite designed to destroy the quality of life for his neighbors. The fines must stand, and the lights and the ivy must be removed." A committee member, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Peterson, shifted nervously. "Mr. Miller, why did you choose this particular type of plant and such bright lights?" David stood up, calm and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He kept his focus entirely on the committee members, ignoring Carolyn. "Mr. Peterson, I filed a city permit for my 7-foot fence because my previous fence, which was 6 feet, was repeatedly interfered with. I needed privacy. When I installed the new fence, I was immediately threatened with fines by Ms. Thorne. The razor ivy was chosen because I needed a plant that would quickly create an impenetrable boundary against further interference. The vines are entirely on my side of the property line. He paused, then looked directly at Carolyn, his gaze cold. And as for the lights, I installed them for security after Ms. Thorne repeatedly trespassed onto my property to take photographs. And as we now know from the city's ruling, engaged in unauthorized surveillance across the property line. He turned back to the committee. The city reviewed the lights and found them compliant with an easy permit fix, which I have filed. And as for the razor ivy, Ms. Thorne is not complaining about the plant. She is complaining about the consequence of her own aggressive behavior. She made a threat, and I responded with a defensive boundary. Michael then stepped in, holding up a thick copy of the HOA bylaws. If the committee rules against Mr. Miller and demands the removal of the lights and the plant, we will immediately appeal. We will argue that the HOA is engaging in selective enforcement designed to retaliate against Mr. Miller for successfully reporting Ms. Thorne's privacy violation to the city. The city has already established who the aggressor was, and the HOA cannot be seen to support a member who engaged in illegal surveillance and harassment. The air in the room became charged with silent, desperate calculation. The committee members looked deeply uncomfortable. They knew if David took this to court, the HOA would likely lose, and the subsequent discovery process would expose all of Carolyn's previous bullying tactics, potentially bankrupting the HOA in legal fees. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. We need to deliberate. The committee filed into a back room. The wait was excruciating. David leaned back, exhausted but resolute. Carolyn, however, was unable to sit still. She paced, her heels clicking angrily on the tile floor, occasionally stopping to give David a look that could curdle milk. You think you're smart? David, she spat, keeping her voice low so as not to carry to the closed deliberation door. You think a Nantext $1,000 fine is a victory? The fines are going to be upheld. You'll be paying for that poisonous, tacky fence for years. I'll pay the fine, Carolyn, but I'll keep my fence and my peace, David replied without looking up. And you'll have a permanent reminder that some people don't break when you lean on them. After 20 long minutes, the door opened. The committee filed back in, their faces solemn. Mr. Peterson stood to read the verdict. The Architectural Review Committee has reached a decision. Regarding the 7-foot fence height, Mr. Miller is in compliance with the city permit, which supersedes the HOA covenant. Regarding the fines for the lighting system, in light of the city's findings and the permit being filed, these fines are vacated. The security lighting, now permitted, is a protected accessory structure. Carolyn's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Mr. Peterson continued, his voice steady. Regarding the razor ivy and the Hemath BF a $250 daily fine for aggressive landscaping, the committee finds that while the plant is visually aggressive, Mr. Miller chose it as a reasonable measure to prevent repeated trespass and interference with his property line, which was confirmed by Ms. Thorne's city citation for surveillance. A collective gasp could be heard. David felt a rush of vindication. Therefore, Peterson concluded, looking directly at Carolyn, the fines for the razor ivy are also vacated, effective immediately. However, to foster community harmony, Mr. Miller is required to trim any razor ivy that extends beyond the top plane of the fence line within 30 days. No further action is required. This hearing is adjourned. Carolyn had lost. She had lost the city fight, and now the HOA fight. She had leveraged her power, threatened lawsuits, and failed to make a single fine stick. David had won his peace. As David and Michael gathered their papers, Carolyn exploded. She did not yell. She simply began to tear apart her presentation, ripping the slides off the projector with a desperate, guttural sound. "This is an absolute outrage," she shrieked, finally finding her voice. "The bylaws are meaningless. You are cowards! I have spent years protecting this neighborhood, and you let that thug defile my view with his tacky razor fence. You will regret this, David. I will not have this blight on my view." She spun around, charging out the clubhouse doors and into the darkening night, leaving the stunned committee and David in her wake. David and Michael walked out to the parking lot. Michael clapped him on the shoulder. "You won, David. You stood up to her, and you won." David looked towards the direction Carolyn had stormed off. S.A.? The tableau in the harsh, blinding glow of the security lights was one of perfect, agonizing irony. Carolyn Thorne, the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, stood immobilized, the red spray paint can dripping the color of her fury, while her beloved Maltese, Princess, yelped in pain, its tiny paw tangled and bleeding in the vicious tendrils of the razor ivy that Carolyn had fought so desperately to have removed. David reached the scene first. He didn't hesitate. He knew the razor ivy's thorns were backward curving, designed to snag and hold. Any sudden pull would tear the dog's flesh. "Don't move, Carolyn! Stay back!" David ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. Carolyn, her mind shattered by the sudden brutal shock, could only stammer, Princess! My baby, get her off!" "The thorns!" David ignored her. He dropped to his knees, pulling a small folding utility knife from his pocket. He had to be surgical. The light, which had been a weapon of intimidation minutes before, now served as an essential tool for precision. He carefully located the stem that had snared the dog's delicate pad. "Michael, call the emergency vet line." "Now!" David yelled back at his lawyer, who was running up behind him, phone already out. With a series of precise, slow cuts, David severed the thorny stem, carefully unhooking the vicious barbs from the dog's fur and skin. The small dog whined continuously, but David's calm, firm touch seemed to keep it from panicking further. Finally, the dog was free. It scrambled away limping before Carolyn snatched it up, cradling it against her expensive blazer, tears finally streaming down her face. Not tears of guilt, but of desperate maternal fear. David stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. The can of red spray paint lay abandoned on the concrete, a silent, damning witness to Carolyn's final, desperate act of vengeance. The intent was clear. She was going to vandalize his fence after the HOA meeting. "You were going to deface my property," David stated, his voice flat and accusing. Carolyn looked up, her face a pathetic mess of smudged mascara and raw emotion. She didn't deny it. Instead, she clutched Princess tighter and lashed out with a defensive, irrational fury. "It's your fault. Your hideous, dangerous fence. You planted that poison. You hurt my dog." "No, Carolyn. I planted a defense against your interference," David countered, pointing at the paint can. "Your dog was injured because it ran into a hazard while you were attempting to commit a crime. The thorns were a consequence of your refusal to respect boundaries." Michael stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "We have an official citation from the city for unauthorized surveillance, a clear verdict from the HOA confirming David's compliance and vacating all your fines, and now we have the physical evidence of you attempting to vandalize his private property. The security lights you complained about just caught you red-handed, Carolyn. This is the end of the line." The committee members, drawn out by the commotion and the screaming, were now gathering in a tight, whispering circle at the edge of the street. They had seen enough. The illusion of Carolyn Thorne's moral superiority had finally collapsed under the combined weight of the city fine, the failed hearing, and the dripping red paint. The weeks that followed were defined by a quiet, absolute shift in power. David did not press criminal charges for the attempted vandalism, but he did something more effective. Michael filed a civil suit against Carolyn. The suit wasn't for millions. It was for the accumulated cost of the entire ordeal, David's legal fees from fighting the frivolous HOA fines, the cost of the fence and its fortifications, now argued as necessary security measures against a documented harasser, and the specific, measurable cost of the time and emotional distress inflicted over the weeks. The total demand was substantial, but more importantly, it was documentable. The threat of a public civil trial, where every detail of Carolyn's intimidation tactics, the surveillance citation, the aggressive text messages, the failed HOA hearing, and the final act of vandalism would be laid bare in court filings, was the ultimate weapon. Carolyn's reputation, which was all she truly valued, would be destroyed entirely and permanently. Howard Sterling, recognizing the impossibility of defending the indefensible, advised immediate settlement. 2 weeks before the civil suit's first deposition, the settlement was finalized. The terms were brutal. tailored by David not just to extract money, but to ensure absolute, permanent peace. Financial restitution. Carolyn agreed to pay Math BF $28,000 to David, covering all his legal fees and the cost of the new fence, lights, and landscaping, HOA censure. Carolyn was forced to resign immediately from the Architectural Review Committee and was permanently banned from holding any position within the HOA. The no-contact order, informal but legally binding. The settlement included a clause that amounted to a permanent cease and desist. Carolyn was forbidden from directly contacting David or his family, communicating with him through agents, including HOA staff and lawyers, except for settlement logistics, or initiating any further code or HOA complaints against his property for 10 years. For Carolyn, the financial loss was painful, but the loss of her power and the enforced silence were devastating. Her authority in Whispering Pines was not merely diminished, it was nullified. 6 months later, spring had returned to the cul-de-sac. David was outside, trimming the razor ivy as mandated by the HOA ruling. The vine had done its job. It was now a thick, intimidating green fortress along the top lattice, dense and completely opaque, a living testament to the conflict. The security lights had not triggered a single time in 4 months. On Carolyn's side of the fence, the yard was unusually neglected. She was rarely seen. Her appearances were brief, muted, and completely devoid of her former aggressive confidence. She was polite to the few neighbors she saw, a defeated ghost in her own meticulously maintained domain. Today, however, she was outside, wearing large sunglasses, attempting to clip a rosebush. She looked tired. She stopped working and stood near the fence, separated from David only by the 7 feet of cedar and the thick, thorny ivy. This time she didn't yell, she didn't threaten. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Did you win, David?" she asked, not with malice, but with a strange, hollow curiosity. David stopped trimming. He looked at the fence, then at her. He saw not the Karen, but a broken, very expensive woman who had learned a crushing lesson about boundaries. "I got my piece, Carolyn," David said simply, his voice low and final. "I got the thing I paid for." He returned to clipping the ivy. The thick wooden wall stood tall and silent, a permanent physical manifestation of his victory. The razor ivy was not just a deterrent. It was the trophy of boundary, forever marking the day her control ended and his privacy began. As he finished trimming the last of the vines that strayed over the top, he saw a small movement by the base of her side of the fence. Princess, fully recovered, was gingerly sniffing at the area where she had been injured months ago. Carolyn, without a word, reached down and scooped the dog up, holding it close to her chest. She finally turned and walked back toward her house, casting a last glance at the imposing, thorny boundary. David had not merely installed a fence that was too tall, he had built an unbreachable wall of consequences. The true victory was the final, profound silence between them. The only sound left in the peaceful cul-de-sac was the quiet snip of David's shears, tending to the very thorns that had delivered the final painful stroke of karma.